Clay Allison may not be as famous as Billy the Kid or Jesse James, but he was every bit as deadly, if not more so. He was also nuttier than a squirrel turd. He got his start in the Civil War riding with Nathan Bedford Forrest. Then, after a brief career as a Texas cowboy, Clay drifted west and found himself knee-deep in the Colfax County War. Make no mistake about it, from New Mexico to Colorado and beyond, Allison left a trail of bodies in his wake. But unlike many other notable gunmen of the 19th century, Clay was not an outlaw. He just refused to back down. He also had a soft spot for the underdogs. But who was Clay Allison really? Once you strip away all of the legends and tall tales. How the son of a preacher become one of the most feared gunfighters of the Old West. And is it true that he once tied a ribbon around his tallywhacker and performed a naked war dance over the body of a vanquished foe? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Robert Clay Allison was born in Wayne County, Tennessee on September 2nd, 1841. And that's it. That is literally all we know concerning Allison's early life. Okay, so I'm being a little facetious. Turns out we do know the names of his parents, Jeremiah and Maria. We know that his father was a Presbyterian circuit rider, and that Clay was the fourth of 8 surviving children. But honestly, that's really about it, other than Clay at some point receiving a pretty serious blow to his head, an injury that would plague him for the rest of his life. According to author Donna Burchell, quote, he, Clay Allison, reportedly had a long recovery but was never the same. The young man became quiet, somber, at times violent, and crazy at other times, end of quote. Now, you often hear that Allison was kicked in the head by a mule, but I've also read that he was thrown from a horse and cracked his skull on a rock. Either way, it's this head injury that would ultimately cause him to be discharged from the Confederate Army. We may not know much about Clay's childhood, but records do show that he enlisted with the Tennessee Light Artillery on October 5th, 1861, and after just 3 short months, he was given the boot. Official documents noted that Clay had been unfit for duty for several weeks, and a surgeon's note that was attached to his discharge papers sheds additional light. Quote, I certify that I have carefully examined the said Allison of Captain Eldridge's artillery company and find him incapable of performing the duties of a soldier because of a blow received many years ago, producing no doubt a depression of the skull, since which time emotional or physical excitement produces mixed character, partly epileptic and partly maniacal. He is now suffering from such a paroxysm caused by an attack of pneumonia during which he manifests a great disposition to commit suicide. End of quote. The discharge also stated that Clay was 5'9" tall, with blue eyes, dark hair, and that he was working as a farmer at the time of enlistment. Now, Clay would re-enlist later on that fall, in late September, but what he was up to in the meantime is anyone's guess. I've read that he operated as a guerrilla or a bushwhacker, and there's even a story of him returning home and killing a Yankee soldier who had been harassing his mother. Zero evidence to support these claims, but that is how the story goes. And unfortunately, that's going to be a constant theme going forward. Not only is there very little in the way of concrete evidence concerning much of Allison's life, but there's also a ton of sensational anecdotal stories. In other words, it can be very difficult to separate fact from fiction. Now, like I said, Clay did re-enlist the following year, and this time he would serve throughout the duration of the war. There are rumors that he spent time as a scout and spy under General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that he escaped from the Yankees on numerous occasions. But once again, there's just not really any evidence. Per historian Chuck Parsons, quote, there are virtually no verifiable exploits of Clay Allison as a Confederate soldier. One legend states that he was captured behind enemy lines and sentenced to death as a spy. Supposedly, he was imprisoned on Johnson's Island in Sandusky Bay off of Lake Erie. He managed to kill his guards and escape by swimming to shore on the eve of his scheduled execution. This must be considered but one of the many dramatic, yet fictional, episodes of Allison's life, as the War Department has no records of Allison being a prisoner on Johnson's Island. End of quote. It's worth noting that when Clay's unit surrendered in May of 1865, he was taken prisoner but for a very brief period, just 6 days, and that was a very common occurrence for surrendering Confederates. Then, just as soon as they let him loose, Clay headed back home to Tennessee and joined the Ku Klux Klan. Maybe. Once again, not a lot in the way of details. I found one source saying that Allison held the rank of Grand Cyclops, whatever the hell that means, and that he called it quits on account of the Klan being too violent. But then again, there were other stories of him leading Klan raids throughout Tennessee and participating in some rather brutal actions. As to whether or not any of this is true, I honestly have absolutely no idea. But we do know that he wouldn't tarry long there in Tennessee. Shortly after arriving home, he and several of his siblings and their families packed up their belongings and moved to Texas, where Allison almost immediately killed a ferry operator by the name of Zachary Colbert. And when I say almost immediately, I mean literally the moment they stepped foot in Texas. Once again, maybe. Story goes that Colbert was ferrying Clay and his family across the Red River when he decided to screw him over on the price. Per Donna Burchell in her book Tall Tales and Half Truths, Clay Allison, quote, Clay decided to teach the ferryman a hard lesson in fairness by nearly beating the man to death. The only thing that saved Colbert from being killed is when both men fell into the Red River, which cooled the temper of Allison enough for the ferryman to escape. Now, that said, there is another story, published years later in 1887, stating that Clay did indeed kill the ferryman. Apparently, he and Colbert had their left hands tied together with rope and fought it out with Bowie knives. Sort of like that fight scene in the movie The Duel, if you've ever seen that. Like I said, we don't know for sure that's what happened, but many historians do think it's at least possible that Allison killed Colbert, as he would have another deadly confrontation with one of Colbert's relatives in the years to come. More on that in just a bit. For now, though, the Allisons would settle on the Brazos River, about 80 or so miles west of Fort Worth. Clay began working as a cowboy and quickly gained a reputation as a solid hand. So much so that he may have even possibly signed on with the legendary Charles Goodnight. The story goes that Allison was one of the original 18 cowboys on the Goodnight Loving Trail, helping to drive around 2,000 head of cattle all the way to Fort Sumner. That said, as with pretty much everything we've discussed thus far, there is no official documentation. Not only are there no written records, but there's also no contemporary records. In other words, nobody else on those cattle drives, including Charles Goodnight, ever mentioned Clay Allison. At least not that I'm aware of. If you've got additional information, please don't be shy and hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. Clay did go to work for another rancher, though, a guy by the name of M.L. Dalton. He did absolutely trail cattle, that much is also true. Hell, at one point, Clay even helped to move several families, including all of their livestock, from the Brazos River all the way to the Texas Panhandle. It was also around that same period when he and his brother-in-law, Lewis Coleman, relocated to northeastern New Mexico, not far from the town of Cimarron. In fact, it was right there in Cimarron where Clay shot himself in the foot, literally. I guess he and a few of his buddies decided to stampede a herd of mules belonging to the U.S. Army. Not really sure why. Maybe it was a joke, or maybe it was the ex-Confederates' way of getting back at their former enemies. But sure enough, during all the excitement, Clay put a bullet in the instep of his right foot, which does not sound like fun. There's actually a couple of photos where you can see the bandage on his leg, as well as his crutch. One of them features Allison by himself, and in the other, he's flanked by two youngsters. These were not Clay's children. They were the Matthews kids, Adie and Joseph. Their father, John, was a good friend of Clay's and a fellow Confederate. He had been wounded during the war and eventually passed away in 1868, at which point Allison took it upon himself to keep an eye out for his buddy's family. He would have kids of his own, which we will get to, but at this point in our timeline, the late 1860s, Clay was still batching it. Now, he would build a ranch just due south of Maxwell, New Mexico. And for the next few years, he pretty much just kept his head down and established himself as a respectable cattleman. Still, though, be that as it may, Clay did enjoy a drink of whiskey on occasion. Like in October of 1870, he was wetting his whistle in a saloon over in Elizabethtown when a woman came barging inside proclaiming that her husband had just murdered their baby boy. What's more, the man had allegedly killed several travelers, whose bodies he disposed of under the cabin. Now, the suspect in question was a former fur trapper named Charles Kennedy. Clay and a few others, including his friend Davy Crockett, no, not that Davy Crockett, rode out to investigate. They found the lady's husband, drunk as a skunk, brought him back to town and threw his ass behind bars. Bones were located, but it was never determined if they were animal or human remains. Nevertheless, Kennedy was found guilty in the court of public opinion, and on October 7th, 1870, Clay and his buddies yanked the accused out of jail and lynched him from a slaughterhouse rafter. Legend has it that Clay then severed Kennedy's head and placed it on a pike above the saloon door. Said he wanted everyone to know what happens when a man turns into a beast. But did that really happen? Well, we do know that Kennedy was lynched, but there are no official records of his head being cut off. And that saloon where Allison allegedly placed the head didn't even exist until 2 years later. This is something I run into all the time when researching these Old West figures. And like I said earlier, it can be very difficult to ascertain where the truth lies. I'm sure Allison was involved with Kennedy's death, but I'm just not sure there's enough evidence showing that he cut the man's head off. I wouldn't put it past him, though. A few years later, in January of 1874, Clay paid a visit to the Clifton House, a popular stage stop some 20 or so miles south of Raton. And while he was there, he decided to engage in a little horse racing. Another local enjoying the festivities was an old boy known as Chunk Colbert. And if that name sounds familiar, it's due to Colbert being the uncle of that ferryman we mentioned earlier, Zachary Colbert. Per the January 14th edition of the Santa Fe Daily, Chunk had been drinking heavily and was, quote, quite conspicuous and generally disagreeable. He threatened to kill several persons against whom he had taken a dislike. Finally, his attention was drawn to Mr. Allison, with whom we are informed he had some previous difficulties. End of quote. Eventually, Clay and Chunk headed inside and sat down for supper, with their guns drawn, by the way. Clay had his sitting on the table next to his plate, while Chunk's was resting on his lap, fully cocked. According to an eyewitness, Clay and Colbert, quote, been together half a day or more, had quarreled more or less, and each was watching for an opportunity to get the drop. I guess Chunk got tired of waiting, so all of a sudden he lunged across the table for Clay's pistol, while simultaneously bringing his own revolver up with his other hand. The only thing is, he bumped the table so the round went wild, and before Chunk was able to thumb back the hammer for a second shot, Clay Allison blew his brains out. So yeah, at just 32 years of age, Clay was already beginning to make quite the name for himself. But it would be the coming troubles there in New Mexico that would really cement his reputation as a man-killer. And by troubles, I am referring to a little something known as the Colfax County War. Now, believe it or not, the war has origins going all the way back to 1841. That's when the governor of New Mexico granted a huge swath of land to Charles Bubian and his partner, Guadalupe Miranda. I'm talking nearly 2 million acres, stretching from southern Colorado down into present-day Colfax County, New Mexico. If you've ever been to Cimarron or Raton or even Elizabethtown, these were all once part of that initial grant. Skip ahead a few years later, and a 25-year-old Lucian Maxwell married Charles Bubian's 13-year-old daughter. Yikes. Long story short, over time, Maxwell would end up with the entire land grant, which he sold to a group of investors in 1870 for a whopping $650,000. The investors formed the Maxwell Land Grant and Railroad Company, which they too sold in 1872 to English investors, who in turn sold it yet again to another group of investors, this time the Dutch, who also just so happened to be in cahoots with the so-called Santa Fe Ring. The Ring, of course, was just a group of crooked-ass attorneys and politicians in Santa Fe, headed up by the likes of Thomas Catron and Stephen Elkins. Now, I know what you're thinking. Gee, Josh, that sure was a nice little stroll down memory lane, but what in the hell does the Maxwell Land Grant and the Santa Fe Ring have to do with Clay Allison and the Colfax County War? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, when Lucian Maxwell controlled the grant, he really wasn't all that picky as to who settled on his land. In many cases, there wasn't even a formal agreement. He just let the people live there in exchange for a small portion of their crops or what have you. And these settlers really were a mixed bag. You had white families, Mexican families, and even Native Americans. Many of these people had been living there since even before the land was originally granted back in 1841, and they weren't about to let a bunch of soft-handed investors run them off. It's also worth noting that there were some pretty serious legal disputes regarding the actual size of the land grant. Some claimed that it was less than 100,000 acres, while others maintained that it was nearly 2 million. That being the case, many of the supposed squatters felt like they were simply homesteading on public land, while others felt like their various agreements with Maxwell should remain intact. Finally, when the courts were unable to evict the settlers, or the evictions just weren't happening fast enough, the Maxwell Land Grant and Railroad Company began recruiting muscle. Naturally, it wasn't long before violence broke out. Now, this really was a complicated situation. I'm obviously not going to be able to cover every aspect of the war, but what started as a fight between the Land Grant Company and the squatters would eventually morph into people from both sides joining forces to oppose the Santa Fe Ring, who, of course, were doing their level best to turn a profit on all that land. To quote historian Corey Recco, the line between the two sides in Colfax County was clearly drawn. On one side was a tight-knit group of men in power, referred to by detractors as the Santa Fe Ring. And on the other side were citizens of Colfax County and surrounding areas who were challenging their power and working to put a spotlight on what they saw as the underhanded scheming of the ring to gain power, land, and wealth at the expense of the citizens of New Mexico. Up to this time, the conflict had mostly been peaceful, as each side attempted to fight in the courts, the press, and the ballot box. But that was about to change. The clouds gathered, the sky darkened, and the storm was about to begin. End of quote, and well said. Things continued to escalate until finally, in September of 1875, a highly respected Methodist preacher, Franklin J. Tolby, was found murdered. Turns out Tolby had been a very vocal critic of the Santa Fe Ring, or as one of his friends put it, Tolby took quite a lively interest against the methods of the Santa Fe Ring and quite openly denounced them. Not only that, but he was rumored to have written a rather harsh critique that was published in the New York Sun, basically just helping to shine a nationwide light on the ring's corruption. Both Elkins and Catron were named, as were many of their illegal and unethical activities. Not long thereafter, a ring sympathizer named Florencio Donahue confronted Reverend Tolby on the streets of Cimarron and tried to goad him into a fight. A bystander intervened, but not before Donahue threatened to kill Tolby. And yeah, sure enough, just a few days later, Tolby went missing. He had preached a sermon over in Elizabethtown, but never made it back home to Cimarron. Last time he was seen alive was on Tuesday, September 14th, when he stopped at a friend's house in the Moreno Valley. His body was discovered in a canyon the following Thursday. The Reverend had been shot twice in the back. His horse was still picketed nearby, and none of his belongings were taken, so it clearly wasn't a robbery. By the way, the guy I just mentioned a moment ago who had threatened to kill Tolby, Florencio Donahue, well, in addition to being a Santa Fe Ring bootlicker, he was also the local mail contractor. But for whatever reason, he was out when Tolby was murdered. Instead, for that day, and that day alone, Donahue hired another local named Cruz Vega. And Cruz's route would have had him following directly behind the good Reverend. This didn't sit too well with many of Tolby's friends. I guess they figured at the very least Cruz should have seen the minister's horse tied up on the side of the trail, and for whatever reason, he failed to alert anyone. Or at the very worst, he was in on it. The dearly departed's assistant, the Reverend Oscar McMains, was especially outraged, stating, quote, "The war is on. The precious blood of settlers has been shed, and we must fight it out on this line. No quarter now for the foreign land thieves and their hired assassins." End of quote, and hell yeah. Sounds like we got us a fighting parson on our hands. And what's more, McMains meant business. He gathered up a few of the Reverend Tolby's admirers, including our very own Clay Allison, and they paid old Cruz Vega a visit in late October. By the way, up till this point, Clay Allison had mostly sympathized with the Santa Fe Ring. Tolby's murder changed that, though. From then on, Allison was solidly on the side of the settlers, a fact he demonstrated by torturing Cruz Vega until he confessed. According to Vega, he was present for Tolby's murder, but it was another guy, Manuel Cardenas, who actually pulled the trigger. Once Cruz was done blabbing, Allison and his buddies placed a noose around his neck and lynched him from a telegraph pole. A couple of days later, on November 1st, 1875, Clay was confronted by Vega's uncle, Francisco Pancho Grego. They were drinking there in Cimarron's St. James Hotel, and after a brief conversation, Pancho went for his gun. The Daily New Mexican reported the incident as follows. On the night of the 1st, Francisco Grego was shot and killed by R.C. Allison. Both parties met at the door of the St. James Hotel, entered, and with some friends took a drink. When the two walked into the corner of a room and had some conversation, Allison drew his revolver and shot Grego 3 times. The lights were all extinguished. Francisco Grego was well known in Santa Fe, where his mother resides. He has killed a great many men and was considered as a dangerous man. Few regret his loss. End of quote. Now, this next part is pretty crazy, but Clay followed up that killing by stripping down to his birthday suit, tying a ribbon around his penis, and performing a celebratory war dance. Allegedly. We do know that Clay and his buddies went on quite the spree, beginning the day after he killed Grego and continuing until that Friday. when, per witnesses, he did indeed return to the saloon and put on a mock war dance over the blood-stained floor. As to whether or not he stripped down and adorned his Johnson with a ribbon before doing so is unclear. As far as I can tell, that particular story comes from just one outdated source, so grain of salt. Now, the following day is when Manuel Cardenas was deposed. Remember, he's the guy who Cruz Vega claimed dropped the hammer on Reverend Tolby, a charge which Cardenas steadfastly denied. According to him, it was Vega, and Vega had been hired by Judge Robert H. Longwill, an attorney named Melvin Mills, Pancho Grego, and that mail carrier, Florencio Donahue. Supposedly, they offered Cardenas $500, but he refused, so the hit went to Vega. According to Corey Recco, quote, Cardenas' statement included some significant names. The accusation that Longwill and Mills, along with Donahue and Grego, were behind the murder is important, not only because of Mills and Longwill's connection to the Santa Fe Ring, but also because of their positions of power. Years later, Thomas Harwood wrote that Tolby told him about the fight that he witnessed where Francisco Grego murdered 2 soldiers, and said Tolby declared his intention to testify before the grand jury. Harwood opined that Grego, whom Tolby was determined to testify against, was behind Tolby's murder. Many years after, in defense of himself, Melvin Mills gave the opinion that Tolby was killed because he openly declared that he saw Donahue and Grego shoot at some Americans, and that he intended to go before the grand jury and secure an indictment. End of quote. Mr. Recco then poses a very important question. If Cardenas was telling the truth, then why involve Judge Longwill or Melvin Mills? Were they just helping a friend out, or did they want Tolby eliminated for other reasons? Quote, Frank Springer later stated that a man named Lara told him that Grego was promised that he wouldn't face consequences for his actions if he would use his influence among the native New Mexicans in favor of Elkins and Longwill in the coming election. Was a deal struck to help Grego? Maybe, but the problem with connecting Tolby's assassination to that deal is that the district court session had happened before Tolby's murder, and the grand jury had already decided not to indict Grego. Another possibility is that Tolby was assassinated to silence him. Not only was he outspoken against the Santa Fe Ring, but his altercation with Judge Palin, which made some believe that Tolby was the author of the letter published in the New York Sun that was critical of New Mexico politicians in the ring, happened just a week before his death. William Morley claimed in an unrelated affidavit that Longwill once told him the right way to run a country was to get someone to shoot the sons of bitches who opposed you. Many in Cimarron were convinced that this was the reason for Tolby's assassination. End of quote. Now, I know I just threw a lot of names and information at you, but if you want to learn all of the various intricacies, I strongly recommend picking up a copy of Corey Recco's book, The Colfax County War. It does shed a ton of additional details or light on the topic. I don't even know what I'm saying right now. I'll drop a link down below if you'd like to check it out. It really is a great book. Corey is an excellent researcher. Now, later on that evening, Judge Longwill hauled ass. I guess he was worried about being arrested. A very valid concern, as authorities did take both Mills and Donahue into custody. Clay had actually been deputized and gone in pursuit of Longwill, but the judge's buddies hid him away at Fort Union. Rather than engage the army in a gunfight, Allison simply returned to Cimarron empty-handed. Melvin Mills ended up being released due to a lack of evidence, but Donahue and Cardenas weren't so lucky. They were kept behind bars to await that grand jury. Or at least that was the plan. On the afternoon of November 10th, they were both subjected to preliminary hearings. And afterwards, when Cardenas was being taken back to his cell, he was shot and killed by an unknown assassin. Many have speculated that the gunman was Clay Allison, but he never fessed up to it. There are others who think maybe it was the Santa Fe Ring who orchestrated Cardenas' murder to stop him from talking. Whatever the case, the residents of Colfax County were growing more and more concerned. In the days to come, a citizens committee was organized, not only to discuss the recent killings, but to also formulate a plan of action. Reverend McMains was elected as the chairman, and when they tried to make Clay Allison the vice chairman, he politely declined. I guess old Clay preferred to take more of a hands-on approach. Like a few months later, when he broke into the offices of the Cimarron News and destroyed their print and press, which we will get to in just a moment. Now, that citizens committee, of which Clay was a member, issued a resolution condemning the army at Fort Union for protecting Judge Longwill. They also called on Tolby's assassins to be brought to justice and claimed that Vega and Cardenas were mere tools that had been duped by other parties. Quote, "We are not a mob of lawless men, as has been reported abroad, bent upon violence and defiance of law, but on the contrary have assembled legally and quietly for the purpose of securing the doing of justice and the punishment of crime." Now, obviously, things weren't all that peaceful, right? I mean, Clay himself had already contributed to the deaths of at least two men connected with Tolby's murder. And then just a few days later, a third was assassinated, possibly by Allison. Also, a detachment of U.S. troops had been sent to Cimarron to restore order. They arrived in town on November 8th and were present when Cardenas was murdered. The good people of Cimarron felt like the Army's presence was both unnecessary and uncalled for. A local paper would even report, quote, "Continual surprise was manifested by persons coming from the South at the condition of peace and order they found. It had been reported that our town was in a state of riot and confusion, that a reign of terror existed, and that it was not safe to pass through here, so that when people came to see the true state of affairs, they could scarcely believe their eyes." The article went on to say that the soldiers found nothing to do and mingled freely with the citizens and were interested spectators in all of the proceedings. Now, not everyone was so convinced. Cimarron's violent reputation continued to grow, and papers as far away as Cincinnati opined that it was safer to congregate with cannibals than it was to visit Colfax County, New Mexico. Hell, things got so bad that the territorial legislature passed a bill transferring Colfax County's judicial powers to Taos County. In other words, the people living in Cimarron and the surrounding hamlets were no longer in charge of their own court cases, nor would they be represented by a jury of their peers, not to mention being forced to travel over 50 miles just to appear in court. Meanwhile, yet another anonymous letter appeared in the New York Sun, describing the murder of Reverend Tolby and speculating that the Santa Fe Ring was responsible, on account of Tolby threatening to expose their corruption. A couple weeks later, the editor of the Cimarron News and Press, Will Dawson, denounced the letter, saying that its author was a coward, a disturber of the peace, and a slanderer upon the good name of New Mexico. Now, that didn't sit too well with many of the residents there in Colfax County. Angry letters poured in, and Dawson's co-editors, William Morley and Frank Springer, began to distance themselves. Finally, things came to a head on the night of January 19th when Clay Allison led a mob to the newspaper office and destroyed the printing press. Believe it or not, they actually blew it off its foundation with some type of explosive and then threw it in the damn river. Clay then took the most recent edition, which was still a work in progress, and wrote his name on the blank side in big red letters. These special Clay Allison editions were sold by Clay the following morning. Now, there was a lady named Agnes Morley Cleveland, the daughter of one of the co-editors, William Morley, and years later, she recalled the incident. According to her, quote, "Clay, with several of his henchmen, dumped the printing press into the river and upset the cases of type. When daylight came, my mother rushed over to view the wreckage. Unexpectedly, Clay himself strode into the wrecked printing office. He saw a young woman in early morning dishevel, her long and very golden hair hanging about her shoulders. She was wringing her hands. When Clay appeared, she turned to him and said, 'Now you see what you have done. You ought to be ashamed of yourself.' Tall, gaunt, with fine squint lines at the corners of his eyes, he stands with his hat in his hand, his forehead above the sweatband line very white, his skin below the line the color and texture of old rawhide. Out of this leathery countenance shines two hazel brown eyes. I love how his eye color changes with every description. Steady and hard, but not vicious. And now, under my mother's scolding, suffused with genuine embarrassment. 'Are you Mrs. Morley?' he stammered. 'Well, go buy yourself another printing press.' And out of his shirt, he drew a wrist-thick roll of greenbacks and thrust them into her hand. 'I don't fight women.'" End of quote. Now, this destruction notwithstanding, Clay and the lady's husband, William Morley, would eventually become allies, mostly due to their shared enemies in the Santa Fe Ring. The general violence did continue, though. Colfax County Sheriff Orson Chittenden claimed that it was impossible to enforce the law, so Governor Axtell replaced him with another guy named Isaiah Reinhardt. The governor then wrote a letter to President Grant calling out Clay Allison by name and asking permission to use the army to restore peace, which, if I'm not mistaken, would have been a direct violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. At the same time, Cimarron's leading citizens invited Axtell to pay the county a visit so he could see for himself that it was mostly a law-abiding community. Just their way of trying to ease the tensions. The only thing is, Axtell declined the offer. Instead, he sent District Attorney Ben Stevens. And everyone did feel like the visit went well. And Stevens even admitted that the people of Colfax County have been misrepresented. He also promised to talk to the governor personally. In fact, he returned just a few weeks later with a telegram from Axtell. Apparently, the governor was planning to visit Cimarron after all, that coming Saturday, but he wanted his arrival to be kept a surprise. Stevens showed the telegram to the newspaper editor I mentioned a moment ago, William Morley, and claimed that Axtell, quote, felt much more kindly towards the people of Colfax County than before, and that he was anxious to meet with them and talk with them. He also said that Axtell wanted to see one Robert Clay Allison particularly, as he believed he had been greatly misrepresented. There goes that phrase again. Turns out the entire thing was a ruse. Not only did Axtell have zero intentions to travel into Cimarron, but he was also conspiring to murder all of the men he claimed he wanted to meet, especially Clay Allison. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this part is a little confusing, but on the same day that Stevens arrived there in Cimarron, William Morley learned of another letter that was also written by Governor Axtell. And it was that letter's contents that led Morley to believe that he and several others were to be, quote, killed under the color of an attempt to arrest some persons on a fictitious charge. He spread the word, nobody showed up for Axtell's fake arrival, and disaster was averted. Now, I have read this letter in its entirety, and Axtell never explicitly says he wanted to kill Clay or anyone else. He does, however, admit that the initial telegram was intended to leak, the one that said he would be there on Saturday. He even admits that it was a trick in order to lure all of his enemies to one spot. He orders his men to arrest Clay Allison and to, quote, kill all of the men who do resist you. He urges the recipient not to hesitate at extreme measures, and that if anyone tried to interfere, to arrest them as well. But he never just flat out orders anyone to be murdered. I'm not saying that wasn't the intention. As you'll soon hear, I do think he was very strongly hoping that Allison would resist arrest and thus be eliminated, but he doesn't explicitly order it. That said, it doesn't exactly take a genius to figure out his true intentions, right? And there were plenty of folks there in Colfax County who felt like it was a setup. Even that newspaperman Morley thought that Axtell was trying to have him and the others assassinated. And maybe he was on to something, as Clay Allison was arrested just a few days later. Soldiers from Fort Union showed up at his ranch, and he agreed to go with them into town without a fuss. They only held him for a few hours, though, as there wasn't really anything to charge him with. Keep in mind, he had already been cleared in the deaths of Colbert and Grego. Hell, even the commanding officer, Captain Francis Moore, wrote that Allison's reputation was that of a man of property and not an outlaw. So who knows? Maybe Axtell really did think that Clay would resist and the soldiers would have no choice but to gun him down. But just didn't work out that way. Now, something else would occur less than a week later that only served to bolster Colfax County's reputation for lawlessness. One of Clay's buddies, Davy Crockett, got into a gunfight with a few Buffalo soldiers right there in Cimarron, in the very same saloon where Allison had killed Grego. And to be honest, I'm not really sure if a gunfight is the proper descriptor, as Crockett just basically murdered 3 people with little to no provocation. He had been getting his load on over in Lambert's saloon, and when he tried to leave, the door was blocked by one of the soldiers. Total accident. Trooper was merely trying to enter at the same time Crockett was leaving. Nevertheless, Davy shucked iron and shot him dead. There were 3 additional Buffalo soldiers seated inside, so Crockett whirled around and shot them as well, killing 2 and wounding the 3rd. Crockett was arrested, but ultimately acquitted after successfully arguing that he wasn't responsible for his actions on account of being under the influence of alcohol. His only punishment was a $50 fine for illegally carrying a pistol within city limits. This lack of consequences apparently emboldened Crockett, as for the next few months he and his buddies ran roughshod over Cimarron. They'd ride their horses into saloons, shoot their guns in the air, vandalize property, just being a bunch of little shits. And at one point, they even held the new sheriff, Isaiah Reinhardt, at gunpoint and forced him to guzzle whiskey until he blacked out. The locals had their fill, and they pressured Reinhardt to do something about it. Finally, he and 2 of his deputies confronted Crockett on the night of September 30th, 1876. Davy laughed at him and dared him to pull the triggers, so they obliged. He was dead before he hit the ground and laid to rest next to those soldiers he killed back in March. And yeah, he was allegedly related to the famous Davy Crockett, but I'm not sure if that's ever been verified. Now, just a few months prior, several Colfax County residents were summoned to appear in court over in Taos. The governor was so nervous that he even had the army stationed there just in case. When the court opened, the judge issued the following summation for the grand jury. Bear with me because this is important. Quote, at the last session of the Territorial Assembly, the neighboring county of Colfax was annexed to Taos County for judicial purposes. During a period of time dating no further back than the 1st November last, no less than 8 homicides have been committed in the town of Cimarron or its immediate vicinity. And since the beginning of the year 1875, at least 16 or 18 men have come to their deaths in brawls or by assassination, to say nothing of the numerous shootings and woundings of which but little note has been taken. It is a matter of shameful and horrid notoriety, at which all decent men may well stand shocked, that one room, Lambert's Saloon, alone in the village of Cimarron, can boast that not less than 6 men have been killed within its walls during the last 9 months, besides having been the scene of many a fierce and bloody encounters not ending in death. It is perhaps no exaggeration to say that there is hardly a plank in its floor, but that it could speak, would tell some fearful tale of blood. Such a record of crime is appalling to the imagination and a disgrace to the civilization of the age and the country in which we live. End of quote. And holy shit, was that judge long-winded. Now, this grand jury would convene for the next 2 weeks. Clay Allison would have a total of 7 indictments brought against him, none of which would stick. And once again, quote historian Corey Recco, the range of charges brought against Allison makes it appear there was a desire to pin some crime, any crime, on him. But he was never put on trial for any of the 7 indictments brought against him. Reverend McMains was also indicted for the lynching of Cruz Vega. Other than that, though, the grand jury basically announced their intentions to not pursue an investigation into the murder of Reverend Tolby. Those in power were simply not interested in the dead Reverend's killers being brought to justice, plain and simple. Now, in early June of that same year, Clay Allison would actually come face to face with Governor Axtell. To this day, nobody knows for sure how the meeting came about, but they did share a stagecoach all the way from Vermejo, New Mexico to Trinidad, Colorado. According to a guy we've already mentioned, Frank Springer, the meeting was planned in order for them to hash out Clay's murder charges. Quote, Governor Axtell made an appointment with him, met him at Vermejo Station, and traveled with him in a friendly way for some 50 miles. A claim which Axtell denied. According to him, when the stage stopped there at Vermejo to change the mail, Allison just hopped on board unannounced. I don't know who's telling the truth here, but I really do like the idea of Clay ambushing the governor and causing him to squirm for the next 50 miles. However, Axtell was a politician, and as such, you can pretty much bank on every word out of his mouth as being a bold-faced lie. Per historian Chuck Parsons, quote, whatever the truth of the meeting between the governor and Clay Allison, he did agree to stand trial on 7 charges. Frank W. Springer defended Clay, William G. Rich prosecuted. 3 of the charges were of first-degree murder in the deaths of Cooper, Colbert, and Grego. No witnesses could be found for the Colbert killing. The prosecution could not prove that Cooper had actually been killed. No indictment was brought against him for the Grego killing. Allison left the courtroom a free man. Now, that guy that Parsons just mentioned, Cooper, had at one point been accidentally wounded by Chunk Colbert. And then 2 weeks after Allison killed Colbert, Cooper went missing. To this day, nobody knows if he was killed or if he just left the territory, and why Allison was charged with his death is completely unknown. But just like with all the other charges, he would get off scot-free. The Colfax County War wasn't over just yet, but it did begin to fizzle out. Mostly thanks to a lady named Mary McPherson and Special Agent Frank W. Angel. I'll spare you all the details so we can get on with the rest of Clay Allison's life, but long story short, they were able to get Axtell removed as governor. Of course, by that point, Clay Allison had already bid New Mexico adieu. And I think that's about a good place as any to stop for today. Please join me here next week to learn all about the remainder of Clay's life, including his visit to Dodge City, his possible confrontation with Wyatt Earp, and whether or not the story's true of him yanking out one of Doc Holliday's teeth. Now, just a quick correction regarding our last episode on Stagecoach Mary. I erroneously stated that her friend, Mother Amadeus, passed away just a couple of months before she did. I was completely wrong. Shout out to listener Tracy for noticing. Mary did die on December 5th, 1914, and Mother Amadeus would live all the way until November of 1919. Rest assured that I have flogged myself vigorously for the mistake. I do plan on fasting for the next several days and walking barefoot on Legos, just in an effort to further repent. Thank you all so much for listening. If you're still hankering for some true tales from the Old West, head on over to patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Peruse the over 300 episodes, including the very bad and very embarrassing early stuff. Small $5 not only gives you access to the entire back catalog of the Wild West Extravaganza and early access to new episodes, but it'll also be a completely ad-free experience. That's right, no more pesky commercials. You'll also have the peace of mind knowing that 20% of your fee goes directly to charity. I'm very proud to announce that our most recent donation, over $300, went to Vets, a 501c3 dedicated to ending veteran suicide once and for all. So a big thank you to all of the patrons who made that donation possible. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got. Till next time, maybe don't go racing horses down in New Mexico, okay? Don't evict people off their lands just so you can make a rich man slightly richer. And whatever you do, don't go tying no damn ribbons around your ding-a-ling. Or anything else for that matter, all right? I don't care how drunk you are. All right, till next week, adios.